Awesome. Can everybody see my screen? Or can you just tell me what you see on my screen? Because screen sharing is still confusing sometimes.
You see the first page of the PowerPoint.
Awesome. But like, do you see like my browser window? Like, is it full screen or is it like too small?
It's not a full screen, but I can see it okay.
Okay. I'm trying to figure out how to make it like have my notes not go away if I make it full screen, but it's okay. I think it's fine. Awesome. We're going to talk about violence and peace, but I want to have a conversation that goes beyond just pacifism and defense, or is peace good and is violence bad? We'll have, I think, a bit more clear understanding of what I mean by appreciating the nuance and the complexity between these two issues as we move through the lecture. Don't be afraid to ask questions. At any point during the lecture, you can just unmute your mic and say, hey, Nick, what about this? Or I'm confused. Can you slow down? That kind of thing. Awesome. So we're going to cover this material in the lecture if you want to help to organize your notes in this fashion. We'll start by having a general intro to peace studies, violence, the sociology of violence, the state monopoly on violence, and infopolitics, violent resistance, and nonviolence. So we're going to begin by just talking generally about peace studies. Peace studies is an interdisciplinary academic field that draws on political science, sociology, history, anthropology, theology, psychology, philosophy, and other fields to understand to develop ways to prevent and resolve war, genocide, terrorism, gross violations of human rights, and general violence. Peace studies is what I am currently, it's one of the things, I have two double majors, but it's one of the things that I'm currently studying throughout my 4 years at Regis University. It's an area of academia that's very important to me and that I have spent the last 4 years trying to specialize in particular, and that hopefully I'll continue studying in grad school. So it's an area of academics that's relatively new, but I think is incredibly important for the next several years of political work. These are two primary goals and learning objectives. The first one's very simple. As the lecture moves on, I want you to understand peace, conflict, violence, and war as phenomenon. But second, I want you to create abstract schemas that accommodate for complexity and nuance in thought about violence and peace. As always, we're working to problematize rather than to pontificate. So there's three broad levels of violence that I want us to review. The first is what we would call the macro level of violence. This is nation-state relations and global systems. It involves things like proxy wars, genocide, nuclear warfare, great power wars, and colonialism. But then second, there's meso, or intrastate conflicts, regional disputes. This can involve things like border wars, ethnic violence, resource wars, and state populist conflicts, conflicts between the state and the people. And then micro level violence, there's interpersonal and individual conflict. So it's things like homicides, suicides, domestic violence, etc. And a key question that I want us to ask as we're moving through to analyze the different manifestations of violence, where they occur and why, is to ask ourselves, where is the state in this equation? In between macro level violence, meso level violence, and micro level violence, where is the state? What role are they playing? And how do we analyze the role that the state plays in violence? I really want us to be thinking about who is a legitimate actor and why. And do we conceive force undertaken by that actor as legitimate, as violent, or illegitimate, and why? So let's talk about direct violence first. Direct violence, for a definition, is violence that's physical or somatic. S-O-M-A-T-I-C, somatic, means relating to the body. It's physical violence that's directly initiated by another human. It's human on human violence. As of 2017, this is the World Health Organization's breakdown of global violence. 30% of global deaths were caused by homicide, something like murder. 20% of global deaths were caused by wars, where other individuals on behalf of the state or some non-state actor in various disputes for things like land, territory, and ideology died. We're not entirely certain how many of those are combatants and how many of those are civilians, but we'll talk about the distinctions in a moment. And suicides, half of all global deaths in 2017, I think this data is pretty consistent since the early 2000s, have been suicides. So cultural violence, or violence that refers to aspects of a culture that can be used to justify or legitimate direct or structural violence, and may be exemplified by religion, ideology, language, art, empirical science, and formal science, is one of the stepping stones that can lead to things like direct violence, like homicide. If we understand direct violence as this direct violence that humans enact on other humans, it's important to understand the levels of violence that can lead to that kind of violence thought. Cultural violence is oftentimes followed by structural violence, or a form of violence wherein some social structure or social institution may harm people by preventing them from meeting their needs. All of which can be compounded and lead to systems of direct violence, things like war, suicide, homicide, etc. Cultural violence justifies the use of maintaining scenarios that are pseudo violent. In those scenarios, institutions, geographies, regions, and schemas create structural violence, which enables all in turn a system of direct violence. So direct violence and negative peace is one of the primary concept contrasts that sociologists and peace theorists employ when talking about violence and peace. We're familiar with direct violence as violence that's initiated by some other human to cause harm on some other human. And negative peace refers simply to the absence of direct violence. If nobody is physically being harmed by another human, then you are experiencing what's called negative peace. Negative peace is nothing more than the absence of physical violence. The absence of physical violence. And MLK refers to a concept or a system that's similar to negative peace in his letter from a Birmingham jail, when he says that it's not enough to say that we need to love peace and to sacrifice for it. So that it's so that one is not waging war. That refers to negative peace, an absence of violence. And MLK is begging the question, is negative peace enough for a holistic or a peaceful version, a peaceful interpretation of society? In his letter from a Birmingham jail, he posits that we have to necessarily create love for peace and sacrifice for it. This leads to the distinction between negative peace and positive peace. We're familiar now that negative peace is the absence of violence, or it's maintaining a fear or an aversion to violence. But positive peace is the attitude, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies, as opposed to just negating peace. And this has to do primarily with expanding our definition of violence. If we hold that violence is simply somatic abuse, whereby individuals experience physical harms, then our definition of violence, I think, is too narrow, and it doesn't reject enough, such that a world without violence is still capable of maintaining or allowing all kinds of sufferings to endure. So, for example, a world with negative peace may be a state where the crime rate has gone down entirely and there are no break-ins, no suicides, and no homicides. You might say that's a pretty good state to live in. But if individuals in that state are still actively experiencing things like homelessness and poverty, those things are still going to be types of violence. And we're going to explain why. It's intuitive on the one sense. We can think like debaters. How can we turn the criteria or meet the criteria of violence as somatic and physical to say that things like homelessness and things like poverty easily meet a physical definition of violence that are connected to chains of responsibility that other humans are entitled to. Those of you, I think everybody at some point will watch my recorded recorded lecture on rights and be thinking when you watch that lecture about the connection between positive and negative rights and duties and positive and negative obligations as they relate to maintaining negative peace or sustaining things like positive peace. This brings us to indirect violence, or what has been referred to so far as structural violence. That's a definition that I think I prefer. So we've known that direct violence is that direct initiation of somatic or physical harm, and it's highly visible. It's things like wars, conflicts, genocides, homicides, suicides, etc. But it's maintained by an invisible system, multiple prongs, either cultural or structural. The peace theorist Johann Galtung, who we'll talk about more later, came up with this diagram you're seeing as the conflict triangle that explains and in many ways parses out how direct violence is made possible. We are familiar by going back to our triangles, our circles, that cultural violence is that violence that justifies structural violence or direct violence. It's a legitimating force that can arise from our language structures, from our ideologies, and from our religions. A good understanding of cultural violence is to think about the 1 to 2 years prior to the Rwandan genocide, a systems of beliefs between Hutsus and Tutsis that had to do with their religion, their dialect, their language, that created a belief system to legitimize or rationalize creating structural violence that led to then the genocide in the form of direct violence. So here's a graph that I think better explains some of this process more explicitly. We're familiar with things like forced displacement, selective killings, but it's uphold by the cultural systems that are intertwined in the everyday attitudes and values of society on the one hand, and issues that are deep-rooted in public policy, political discourses and institutions, things like the new Jim Crow, for those of you who are familiar with that kind of terminology and familiar with the work of Michelle Alexander on new racism, institutionalized racism in the United States in particular. Here's a final diagram on this relationship that I am far more fond of, that I think is more modern, as opposed to the triangle, this kind of rhombus of violence. The direct violence is physical and sexual assault, war, political violence, and it incorporates psychological trauma, which I think is an adequate example of direct violence that we should widen our schema to accommodate. Empowered by things like cultural violence, these are racial and ethnic stereotypes, gender stereotypes that allow us to do things like pervade systems of gender violence and sex-based violence. Ethnocentrism, all of these things lead to internalized norms, and the normativeness of that kind of culture leads to the justification of violence. Also, this graph incorporates eco-violence, things like climate change and the extinction of biological species, or reduced biodiversity that will inevitably lead to forms of direct violence like war and resource scarcity. And then again, we're familiar with now structural violence. This is cumulative discrimination, deprivation, malnutrition, and inequality and denial cannot be divorced from each other in either their mechanisms or in their, I think, carrying out in their execution. This is Johann Galtung the French theorist, sorry, not French, the Swedish theorist who is familiar and responsible for creating many of the concepts so far that you talked about as they relate to the conflict triangle and structural violence. You can find more information on Johann Galtung and his distinctions in his preliminary essay that outlined a lot of this thought called Violence, Peace, and Peace Research, though Galtungian studies is now an entire branch of peace studies that you can do a ton of your own research on if you feel so inclined. Now that we understand some of the introduction to peace studies or the concepts and relationships that peace studies is trying to either formulate or tackle so as to solve, it's important to move on to the psychology of peace and violence so that we can understand what motivates individuals to have things like violence aversion or things like violence participation. Philip Zimbardo, who is the social scientist familiar, he's the principal researcher behind the often noted Stanford Prison Experiment. We'll talk slightly about the Stanford Prison Experiment, though I think it's an overly saturated and overly trite example. And there's better research out there that I think has stronger methodologies that demonstrates many of the same things that the Stanford Experiment discovered. But Philip Zimbardo said, if you put good apples into bad situations, then you get bad apples. We're going to begin by talking about a need to belong. The need to belong refers to the idea that humans have a fundamental motivation to be accepted into relationships with others and to be a part of social groups. The fact that belongingness is a need means that human beings must establish and maintain a minimum quantity of enduring relationships. And we see this in a chronological aspect when individuals have an infantile need to belong, a childlike need to create friends, an adult need to establish romance and eros, and I think a later life need to have connection to things like grandchildren or your loved one, as well as something like an oftentimes fear of death. This need to belong is primordial. It's in all humans and is a basic intuitive sociological fact of life that has psychological roots and elements that are likely evolutionary. That is to say, evolutionary psychology tells us that our need to belong oftentimes has lent itself to adaptation and survival skills. It lends itself to motivations and schemas of group organization that allow us in groups and divide labor in a way that makes sense. The need to belong is also intuitive in other aspects of life. In particular, something that I think we're all familiar with, and if we're not, then we definitely should be, is Maslow's hierarchy of need. Maslow, in his hierarchy of needs, outlined a feeling of belongingness as part of the key psychological needs that come before things like esteem and self-actualization, but that can only be sustained after physiological and safety needs are met. The need to belong is going to highlight for the rest of the psychology of peace and violence why things like violence arises or how it can be sustained. The next concept that I want us to cover in the psychology of peace and violence is a concept known as the banality of evil. This is a concept that all individuals, especially debaters, should familiarize themselves with. And it arises from the work of a philosopher known as Hannah Arendt, H-A-N-N-A-H, and then Arendt, A-R-E-N-D-T. Hannah Arendt is a Jewish philosopher and student of the Nazi philosopher Martin Heidegger. Yeah, like really interesting go figure there. The Jewish philosopher was a student of the Nazi philosopher, but they were in love. Anybody who's curious for the drama between Heidegger and Arendt can read into it. They sent notes back to each other. Arendt was completely taken aback by the fact that Heidegger was a Nazi and Arendt was a Jew. She was a prominent journalist at the time also, and a student of Heidegger who was teaching at many famous universities across Germany before and during the height of the Second World War. Heidegger supposedly in a love letter to Hannah Arendt after the end of the war denounces his Nazism. But if you ask me, somebody can't just like be a Nazi for the entirety of World War II and then denounce the Nazism just to try and get Hannah Arendt to fall back in love with them. Anyways, back to the topic. Hannah Arendt is credited with authoring this concept of the banality of evil as she's writing a book known as Eichmann in Jerusalem. At the time, she's working for The New Yorker, an American magazine in New York City, and she is a philosopher at New York University and some universities in Germany. And she's following this historic moment, the Nuremberg trials, where numerous individuals who are SS officers and high-level Nazi officials are being held on trial for their actions. And she's sitting in these courtrooms with her notebook, keeping careful notes of these trials, some of the only notes that we have of them in terms of philosophical inquiry. And she ends up formalizing this now famous concept that evil is banal. It's the result of ordinary working men in ordinary circumstances. Hannah Arendt decided that evil, not by bureaucrats, but by joiners, that evil originates in the neediness of lonely, alienated bourgeoisie people who live lives so devoid of higher meaning that they give themselves fully to movements. In the cross-examination of Adolf Eichmann, the man that you see in the left-hand side in the picture during the Nuremberg trials, psychologists and jurists alike noted a strict mundaneness in Eichmann's responses to questions during cross-examination. A lot of his responses were, I was just following orders. He was an incredibly ordinary man. There was nothing special about him, no overarching mastermindness. In fact, a team of 15 separate individual psychologists, all of them, came to the conclusion that there was nothing insane, abnormal, or that lended itself towards madness about Adolf Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann is the person who, in all reality, came up with a plan to use furnaces and trains to create a system of mass extermination. But he was part of a larger group that got a promotion and higher pay and a mansion for his family for doing so. But in many ways, an incredibly ordinary working man in ordinary circumstances of Nazi Germany who did evil, such that evil is not the result of some large, grandiose, miraculous, mad, genius-like process. Those narratives are very common, but the result of ordinary circumstances and mundane but banal individuals who are capable, like many of us, of great evil when put in the right circumstances. This leads us to the Milgram experiment, an experiment that was conducted in 1974 for those of you who want to do more research. And Milgram's obedience experiment shows that the most ordinary people are willing to harm others when told to do so by some kind of authority figure, especially an authority figure that represents patriotism or the law. So Milgram had a researcher known as the experimenter direct commands to the subject, who was giving electric shocks to a fake test subject that they could only see either behind a large mirror or a large screen. The experimenter would say, issue a dose of electricity and increase the voltage as necessary. And the experimenter would maintain a very calm and authoritative attitude while doing so. And the subject would do what the experimenter asked them to. Prior to this part of the experimenter would ask the subject to do a series of more mundane and more banal tasks that didn't involve shocking a human being. Things like things up, putting objects into cases. Excuse me, very mundane tasks. Excuse me. The fake test subjects, the important to know is fake. They didn't actually exist. But Milgram's subjects showed that the vast majority of people, 7 out of 10, had absolutely no problem forcing a human being to endure high levels of pain and excruciation as long as they were told to do so by an authority figure that their personal schemas interpreted as legitimate. Somebody in a military uniform, perhaps a police officer, or a clergy member. This is all in line with the psychological process that we call de-individuation, a process that I think that we observe most often either in cults or through things like conscription and military training. It's the process whereby an individual goes through things like it's influenced by group presence and size, social arousal, their physical anonymity, decreased self-awareness, diffuse responsibility, and then finally de-individuation. This leads to increased responsivity to situational cues and a loss of normal inhibitions. It's the result of what we call the discontinuity effect, or the tendency for groups to be more antagonistic, competitive, and mutually exploitative than individuals. Just going to give you a moment to review this graph. Sorry, this chart, this diagram, I should say. And de-individuation and groupthink, or the discontinuity effect, are all results of these kinds of psychological processes that are intuitive to individuals regardless of circumstance, but prove that circumstance rather than character, this is the important part, circumstance rather than character is more likely to be the deciding factor on how an individual treats another human being. So now that we understand some of the basic concepts behind peace studies and the psychology that can explain and enable things like violent or group violent behavior, we're going to move to a conversation about the sociology of violence itself. Here's an ecological model for understanding violence, individual, relationship, community, and societal, all different styles of violence. This is similar to our macro, meso, and micro levels of violence. But it shows the ways in which people can experience violence at all levels of that chain. Individuals don't only have to experience things like micro-violence. If you're experiencing micro-violence, in fact, there's a higher chance that you're experiencing things like macro-level violences, because things like global war tend to seep themselves down to all levels of society, increasing the kinds of violence. Things like proxy wars lead to things like instability, a lack of economic resources, malnutrition and hunger, which can do things like increase intergroup conflicts, allow individuals to turn to larger groups that offer things like salvation, and then also experience interpersonal violence because of the ways violence is permeating all levels and aspects of society. This can be explained in various topologies of violence. So violence can have self-directed, interpersonal, or collective topologies that can be either on the self-directed level, suicidal or self-abuse oriented, on the interpersonal level, familial or community derived, and on the collective level, social, political, or economic, which can have itself be manifested in physical, sexual, psychological, or deprivation natures and scenarios of violence, all of which are incredibly possible and that manifest themselves at all levels of those topologies. But the comparison of power dynamics is very important to know when speaking about the sociology of violence, because violence between two individuals is a conflict that's bad and should be addressed and resolved, and can have its own power dynamics as well. But power dynamics between individuals that have less power or capital and have more power or capital is systematic violence, when it's institutions against people, states against people, groups against groups with less power and less capital, because of things like decade or century-long historical disenfranchisement, shows the distinctions between conflicts and systemic violence. I think all of these things are important to add nuance and complexity to the different topologies of violence, or to the ecologies of understanding violence. But I also want to talk about how individuals react to violence, as opposed to how individuals simply experience or persecute and are the ones that actually exercise violent activity and violent behavior. This is Kitty Genovese. Kitty Genovese was a New Yorker, and she was walking home one day from work in 1964 when she was brutally attacked, sexually assaulted, and then murdered. I think that she had something like 27 stab wounds in her, and her entire attack lasted roughly 25 minutes, I believe. 37 individuals saw the murder, but not one person called the police. We know that 37 individuals saw the murder because after the murder happened and the police finally arrived to the scenario, because a 38th person who I think saw her, that didn't witness the event happening, but came across Kitty in the street, called the police. And the police began to interview individuals who lived nearby, especially in an apartment building that had windows that faced this area. And they found 37 individuals who confessed and said, yeah, I saw that happen. And they all gave strikingly similar details of the event and helped the police to paint a cohesive picture of exactly how many times she was stabbed, at what time, and what events occurred in what order, even what the assailant looked like. 37 different individuals who all saw, but none of them reported. And of the 37, 28 of them all had a similar reason for not reporting. They assumed that somebody else who saw it would, because it was a very large, loud, and graphic event. And they assumed that surely somebody else is going to enact, going to step forward, going to get help. But Kitty Genovese died. She never received any help, and popularized what sociologists now call the bystander effect, or the tendency of individuals to do nothing out of an over-rationalization that it's either not their place or that surely somebody else is doing something. This compounds and codifies the psychology of violence that stresses that it's far more about scenarios and circumstances than it is things like individual character, etc. The fact that we're all capable of these kinds of activities because it has to do with rationalization processes innate to our mind that perhaps for things like evolutionary psychology have been normalized, etc. The bystander effect since 1964 has seen a significant decrease. We highly educate on the bystander effect in things like high schools, junior highs, and middle schools when talking about things like stranger danger, violence, etc., such that I'm pretty sure there's data out there on the bystander effect going down throughout the last few decades, but still being prominent, or at the least intriguing and helpful in explaining the psychology and sociologies of violence. But now I want to talk about intentionality before we end the conversation on the sociology of violence. One of the more complex aspects about the definition of violence is the matter of intentionality. There's two important points about this that I think should be noted. First, even though violence is distinguished from unintended events that result in injuries, the presence of an intent to use force does not necessarily mean that there was an intent to cause damage. Indeed, there may and oftentimes is a considerable disparity between intended behavior and intended consequence. So that's the first thing to note, is between intention and if it matters because of things like consequence. A perpetrator may intentionally commit an act that by objective standards is judged to be dangerous and highly likely to result in adverse health effects, but the perpetrator may not perceive it as such. An example is a youth may be involved in a physical fight with another youth. The use of a fist against the head or the use of a weapon in the dispute certainly increases the risk of a serious injury or death, though neither outcome may be intended. A parent may vigorously shake a crying infant when they attempt to quiet it. Such an action, however, may intend to cause brain damage, and force was clearly used, but without the intention of causing injury. So intention is something that likely doesn't matter. But a second point that I think is important for intention lies in the distinction between the intent to injure, which is distinct and can be explicit, and the intent to use violence. Violence is culturally determined. Some people mean deliberately to harm others, but based on their cultural background and belief systems, don't perceive their act as violent. This definition is employed by the World Health Organization because it defines violence as it relates to the well-being of individuals, as opposed to cultural definitions and certain behaviors that mark actions as violent. For example, certain behaviors such as hitting one's spouse may be regarded by some people as acceptable cultural practices that concede an intentional use of force, but would never, when surveyed, be examples of violence or part of violence-based schemas that members of those culture have. But members of those culture will still concede and identify other things as violent. So intention has a relationship to sense and the object, but is more intended by outside, the for how they perceive intentionality and if it's violent or not. Awesome. Now we'll talk about the state monopoly on violence. And first, I want to talk about legitimacy. When is violence legitimate such that we don't care about it anymore as a bad action? And it typically has to do with the power of the state and the state's complex and I think overly rationalized sometimes relationship to violence. So the state is responsible for performing and enacting institutionalized uses of force, which can bound and regulate the territory. And the territory bounds and justifies the question of legitimacy. And legitimacy on behalf of the state justifies and enforces the use of force. And the state in turn justifies and monopolizes legitimacy, and it monopolizes and bounds things like the territory. In other words, the state is the only legitimate actor that can oftentimes pursue violent behavior without kind of a question of morality being imposed. Instead, the conversation becomes not about morality and now about some other secondary euphemism, typically politics. I'll give you a second to overview this web of connections here before we move. And this leads to what we call the state of exception or the state of emergency. Those of you who last year took my elective on the state of exception itself, on the way in which great power conflict and great power wars subject the individual members of the home nation to more violence than they realize, or the ways in which things like global terrorism is the euphemism. I think Miles, maybe Jonathan, and maybe Genevieve were all in the elective last year, but maybe none of you were. But the state of exception refers to the power of the sovereign. Carl Schmitt has this quote that the sovereign is he who decides on the exception. So this might sound confusing, but I think a good intuitive first example is to look at Trump and Mike Pence and mask wearing, right? So, or just, I think the Trump administration as a whole, many of its arguments in legal defense rely on this idea of executive privilege, that the rules apply to everybody except for the person who creates the rules. That's what this quote talks about, that the sovereign is he who decides on the exception. The person in charge gets to decide the parameters or the limits. And this is, I think, an idea that we oftentimes see in the monopoly on violence or the monopoly on force, especially as it relates to things like international law. The US is responsible for, in many ways, creating the infrastructure behind the international criminal courts, the international statutes on human rights, and The Hague to try war crimes. But the US will never, I promise you, at least as long as we're alive, never have an elected official be tried for war crimes. I think that by the definitions and criteria that the US officials have used to try African warlords for war crimes, by some of the definitions and criteria that we have tried other individuals at The Hague, Bush, Henry Kissinger, and potentially even Obama could all easily be tried, I think, for war crimes. Whether or not they would be indicted is a separate conversation. But I think Bush, Henry Kissinger, and Obama all easily could be tried for war crimes, but they will never be tried for war crimes. Instead, the US will continue to lend our resources to capture other individuals and try them for war crimes. This is similar and analogous to, I think, a big hot topic issue in the States right now, for police officers to have a monopoly on violence and to be exempt from some of their uses of violence, or at the very least, to have that use of violence exempt from heightened levels of scrutiny. And it has to do with some of the same logic, that there's something about doing the job, something about legitimacy, something about being the sovereign that leads to you deciding on the exception for the use of force. And all of these types of force rest on that legitimacy. The state monopoly on violence only exists because the state decides that if anybody else uses violence, they go to jail. And violence can only be used by the state for things like territory. And we justify and create all those processes. And anything else is non-legitimate, non-state, and therefore, I think has to be characterized as terrorism from the idea of state violence or state monopolies on violence. This brings us to just war theory. And just war theory is a theory that has existed since Thomas Aquinas. It's been popularized by theologians. It's used by generals, ethicists, moral philosophers, and political philosophers. And is, I think, a really comprehensive theory that all individuals should familiarize themselves because it's very useful for debate rounds in particular. And the criteria is split into two groups. The right to wage war, jus ad bellum, and the right to conduct in war, or jus in bello. The first concerns the morality of going to war, and the second concerns the morality of conduct within war. And recently, there have been calls for the inclusion of a third category of just war theory, known as jus post bellum, that deals with the morality of post-war conflict. And just war theory posits that war, while terrible, and less so with the right conduct, is not always the worst option. Important responsibilities, undesirable outcomes, and preventable atrocities all may justify a war. So jus ad bellum, or the right to go war, has a few criteria. The first is just cause. The reason for going to war needs to be just and cannot be solely for recapturing things taken or punishing people who have done wrong. There has to be just cause. Innocent life must be in imminent danger, and intervention must be to protect life. The second criteria is comparative justice. While there may be rights and wrongs on all sides or both sides of a conflict, to overcome the presumption against the use of force, the injustice suffered by one party must significantly outweigh. Some theorists admit this term, seeing it as fertile ground for exploitation by bellicose regimes and easy to things like turns on both sides of the house. And then the third criteria is competent or legitimate authority. Only duly constituted public authorities may wage war according to just war theory. That is, only democratically elected governments. A just war must be initiated by a political authority within a political system that the fourth criteria is right intention. Force may only be used in a truly just cause and solely for that purpose. Correcting a suffered wrong considered a right intention, while material gain is not. It has to be for something like human dignity, right intention. The fifth is probability of success. War may or may not be used based off of based off the likelihood that you can win. If you don't think that you can win the war, then your nation is unjustified in trying to have that war be waged. You have to have a reasonable or high probability of success. And then fifth, or perhaps sixth, I lost track of count, is last resort. Force may be used only after all peaceful and viable alternatives have been exhausted and have been unsuccessful. Great. This brings us to jus in bello, or right conduct in war. The first criteria is proportionality. The war must be proportional. The tools that we use, the kind of power that we exert, has to be proportional to the to the suffering that we are correcting. So things like nuclear bombs would not be proportional to probably the majority of atrocities or harms. Second is distinction. Just war conduct should be governed by the principle of distinction between combatants and non-combatants, or legitimate military targets and non-legitimate military targets, things like civilians, or the right treatment of prisoners of war. Distinction. And then third is I said this already, proportionality, that's first actually. Third is military necessity. Just war conduct should be governed by the principle of military necessity. An attack or action must be intended to help the defeat of the enemy and be a legitimate military objective. It can't be for the sake of simply expanding military and necessary in war. Just because we're in a war doesn't mean that the military can do whatever it wants. Just conduct in war means surgical attacks that are necessary. And then no ill means, or what in Latin is called malum in se, M-A-L-U-M, malum, and then I-N-N-S-E, say, malum in se, and that combatants may not use weapons or other methods of warfare that are unnecessary, ineffective, or unevil, and have no other purposes than inflicting general suffering. These are things like mass rape as a tool of war, forcing enemy combatants to fight against their own sides as prisoners of war, and using weapons whose effects cannot be controlled, like biological weapons, things like mustard gas, etc. Awesome. And now we're going to talk about infopolitics, violent resistance, and non-violent resistance. The first thing to talk about is Erica Chenoweth and a lot of the work that she's done, because she's awesome. I've had the ability to study under her and do research with her. She is currently at both the Harvard Kennedy School and the University of Denver. She spent a year on sabbatical at Regis University for famous faculty coming to do sabbaticals on our campus because of how beautiful our campus is. They won't do a lot of teaching. They'll just come, they'll have a quiet, beautiful place to do their research, and they'll work with several research assistants from the university. And I've had the ability to work with Erica Chenoweth, and she is fantastic. I think everybody should familiarize themselves with her research because it's entirely empirical, and that's what makes it so fascinating. So Erica Chenoweth analyzed a ton of conflicts. I think about 1,500 of them between 1900 and 2006. And here are her noteworthy findings. Between this time period, campaigns of nonviolent resistance against authoritarian regimes were twice as likely to succeed as violent movements. Second, non-violent resistance also increased the chances that the overthrow of a dictatorship would lead to peace and democratic rule. Also, non-violent resistance was able to garner a larger, more base of participants. And finally, violent or armed dependence or armed resistance were heavily dependent on foreign support or outside support, which led to things like ostracization, alienation, and not enough political capital for that group to be successful the majority of the time. So Erica Chenoweth's research is groundbreaking, literally groundbreaking, and that it empirically proves that the vast majority of nonviolent resistance is effective in the long run. But what's noteworthy and important about this research is it's entirely empirical. It's not normative. It says nothing about the right justifications of violence in overthrowing injustice. I think that principles of self-defense employed by the Black Panther Party in the 60s, current principles of self-defense being employed by the Kurds against the Turkish attacks, current principles of self-defense and violent resistance being employed by the Zapatista movement in southern Mexico are all highly legitimate, and are legitimate because not only do they just happen to meet, I think, good criteria of just war theory by and large, but they also, I think, highlight the structural inequities or power dynamics of individuals who have to combat force violently. Oftentimes, historically, violent resistance has a most explicit connection to principles of socialism and communism, because private property and the police have historically gone hand in hand. If you're interested, you could look up Vicky Osterwell, V-I-C-K-Y, that's Vicky, and then O-S-T-E-R, W-E-I-L, Vicky Osterwell. She is responsible for writing a book. The name of the book, I think, is called A Righteous History of Looting. That might not be the name of her book, but she also has done the opposite of Erica Chenoweth, empirical work on the success of things like looting, violence, of riots. And she has a lot of interesting work, such as situating violence as perhaps justified when used by minority populations. She says recently on looting happening across the nation that the mystifying ideological claim that looting is violent and non-political is one that has been carefully produced by the upper ruling class, because it is precisely the violent maintenance of property by the police and by the upper bourgeoisie, which is both the basis and the end of their power. Looting is extremely dangerous to capitalism and the rich because it reveals with an immediacy that has to be moralized away that the idea of private property is just that, an idea, a tenuous and contingent structure of consent, backed up only by the lethal force of the state. When rioters take territory and loot, they are revealing precisely how in a space without cops, property relations can be deconstructed and destroyed, and things can be had for free. But on a less abstract level, there is a practical and tactical benefit to mass violence and looting. Whenever people worry about looting, there is an implicit sense that the looter must necessarily be acting selfishly or opportunistically and in excess. But why is it bad to grab an opportunity to improve well-being or to make life better, easier, or more comfortable? Or as Hannah Black put it on Twitter, cops exist so people can't loot and have nice things for free, so I don't know why it's so confusing that people loot when it's protest against cops, end quote. Only if you believe that having nice things for free is amoral, if short, you believe in the legitimate acquisition of that property in the first place, then this moralization away can be effective. But looting shows that groups have competing claims and that cultural context often matters more in the context of moralizing away. That's just a large quote from the work of Vicky Osterwell, somebody who writes on the opposite side of Erica Chenoweth. Awesome. So that's the end of my lecture. There's a couple of minutes before we're going to go to debate. So if there are any questions, let's see, Grace Kim had the question. Where would civil wars and such fall? Civil wars would be an example of those meso conflicts, those intrastate conflicts between ethnic groups and regions. Yeah. Are there any other questions? I think we only have 1 minute. I'm sorry, it was a really long lecture, but I hope I got lots of content in there that you're all appreciative of.
So like